Hello everybody and welcome. This is webinar 17 of the Costing and Pricing Learning Program, and my name is David Gilchrist. Today we're looking at costing practice. We're continuing our practical view of costing and pricing, and particularly looking at understanding service volume. It's fair to say, I think, that this webinar is probably most suitable for people operating in small, medium organisations. Larger organisations probably won't get as much use out of this. However, I think the webinar is useful in terms of understanding principles of service volume and how to use service volume from a strategic perspective. Of course, the copyright arrangements do affect this particular webinar. Remembering you can use the webinar for any practice whatsoever, including for paid training purposes or any capacity building purposes, but you can't disaggregate the material and use it separately, and you can't change the colours or the logos. Navigation, remembering the previous webinar was costing practice, and we looked at costing tools in terms of how to choose tools and what to do with those. This webinar, of course, is understanding service volume, which hopefully will build into the next webinar, webinar 18, which looks at workforce planning. The learning objectives here then are to really identify the key principles of volume control and using volume from a strategic perspective. In other words, we're looking particularly at service mix in this particular webinar. It builds on the previous webinars related to costing and pricing, so you should go back and have a look at those for a refresher if you feel you need to. However, this webinar specifically looks at questions like how much of each service should we provide, what is the financial impact on our mission, and what is the best service mix for our organisation. When we're looking at any of these costing and pricing webinars, of course, we're interested in the target price gap. That is the difference between the target price, the price that we really want to get, the achieved price, which is that offered by funders, such as, say, the NDIS, and the difference between those two is the target price gap. This webinar and this topic is actually a little bit different in the sense that we're very much interested in the achieved price versus the cost of service delivery rather than the target price. We're actually wanting to use our actual income per unit of measurement, so that is per iteration of services, to be able to determine what number of services we should provide of what service types. Indeed, the service mix is a combination of services as represented by the number of each service type, the target price gap for each individual service type, and the cumulative impact of each service's target price gap multiplied by the number of each service provided. So in other words, when we talk about service mix, we're actually stepping up from costing an individual iteration of a service or a product and looking at the, if you like, the cumulative effect on all of the products that you provide and the numbers of those products. It's a way of perhaps looking at how many of what type of product you should provide to get the best financial outcome, and stepping back from that, thinking about that in the context of mission. And of course, it is up to individual organisations to make these decisions, to work out what they should be doing, but remembering that it's a balanced process. You need to be sustainable, and therefore your organisation needs to be as profitable as it can be in the context of the objects of the mission of your organisation. And there tends to be, not always, but there tends to be a play-off between the two. Let's explore this a little bit further. We base our assessment on a fully costed product profit. So I've got an example that I'll show you shortly. However, when we are looking at the service mix, we're interested in the true cost of service delivery, or the comprehensive cost of service delivery for each product that we provide. And I'll use that term product from now on to identify that it's one individual unit of measurement, to use the NDIS term. And we're interested in the profit rather, that particular individual product provides. We assess service mix via the profit or contribution margin, which is another way of looking at it, provided by each unit of measurement. So we're going to assess our service mix and our profitability by looking at the number of services provided for each type of product and what kind of profit that product might deliver. As I mentioned before, we are interested in the achieved price, so the target price is not so relevant to this particular discussion, but equally we're interested in likely productivity. That is, what we think we can provide as opposed to what our capacity is. And there could be a big difference between the capacity of an organisation and the level of output that it's expected to provide. Remember, this is a sort of a budgeting process, a little bit like costing and pricing itself. You're trying to forecast how many services you can provide over a period in order to understand the financial impact of that provision. The other thing that we can do with service mix that's really important is that if we build a model, and most organisations use MS Excel to support them in these kind of modelling arrangements, we can start to scenario build by looking at added productivity capacity in certain areas so that we can produce more of a particular service. However, we must fully cost the process in order to examine the profit for each mix. And hopefully when I demonstrate this in the example, that'll look a little bit more clearer to you if you're not used to thinking about things in terms of the service mix and volume of an organisation. But simply what we're saying here is that when you understand the service mix that you have at the moment, you can start to play with variables, that is, how many of each type of service you provide, to try and understand, for instance, what is your most favourable financial mix, what might be your most favourable mission-centred mix, and we'll look at that in terms of an example. However, we need to remember a few things about service mix first. Firstly, there's no right answer in the sense that each organisation needs to work out its priorities regarding service mix. What I had said in the example, as you will see, is that there tends to be a gap or a tug of war between pure mission-based operations and, if you like, the profitability of the organisation. Now, this is not always clear, and it's not always as simple as that, because a lot of services that you provide may be profitable, but they may also be germane to your mission. However, some of the organisations that are represented and listening to this webinar would be also having a number of services that they might provide that usually are profitable, but they might provide those services to people who are unable to pay or to people who are unfunded for the service, because that's part of your mission as an organisation. And we need to get a sense of what the mission centricity, the mission focus should be, as opposed to what the financial focus should be. Again, only your organisation can answer that. There is no right answer. In that context, though, service mix needs to be examined in the context of your organisation's capacity and its likely productivity, likely demand for each product, so there's no point in deploying staff to produce a particular product for which there's no demand, just because that product potentially has a better profit, and the extent to which the expected return can be achieved. So there's two really important elements to that. The first one, as I mentioned before, is whether or not the number of products that you want to put in the field, that you want to deploy, are going to be consumed or demanded by your clients. And the second is the extent to which your actual expected return can be achieved. This goes back to costing and pricing principles and that continuous revisiting or reasonableness check over your assumptions in your costing and pricing process. I'd revisit the costing and pricing webinars in this regard just to make sure that you're on the same page in the context of the service mix and how you might understand it. I guess the final point is always an important point, and one that's raised in a lot of webinars in this series, and that is that we should always undertake reasonableness checks before making decisions. Always reasonableness checks, perhaps even always scenario building as well. Let's have a look at this example. This is XYZ Inc., admittedly, a not very entertaining or thought through name for the organisation, but I think the example is probably the best example. This is the base data for XYZ Inc. It's a human services organisation, and as you can see, it provides a number of services or products. The services are provided in metro and country in some instances, or they're just general services in other instances. On this panel, we've got the unit of measurement type, so whether we measure each service delivery by a week, by an hour, whatever it happens to be. We've also got the target price, the achieved price. So our target price, of course, is the result of our costing and pricing process, whereas our achieved price is what we're actually funded. Our comprehensive cost of service delivery is identified there, and the profit for that service type, that is the delivery of each unit of measurement for that particular service type, is provided in that last right-hand column. Just to run through that, if you look at Accommodation Support Metro, which is the service type at the very top of the matrix, we account for that, or have as a unit of measurement, 1 week. Our target price for that was $2,708. That's the target price we calculated from our costing and pricing process. Our achieved price, that is the price that was provided by our funder, is $2,200, while our comprehensive cost is $1,950. Taking $1,950 comprehensive cost from our achieved price leaves us with a profit of $250 for each iteration of that service. Now, if you go down that column, you'll see that there are various elements returning profits, service types returning profits. There's also 2 service types returning losses. And we need to, I guess, have a think about what levels of each type of service we should be developing and promoting within our organisation, strategically pursuing, in order to get the best outcome of the balance between profitability and sustainability and our mission objectives. Now, this is just the target data. This data has been made up. It doesn't relate to any lived example or any real funding arrangements. It's purely conjectural data that's been developed for the purposes of this exercise. Let's have a look at the next panel, which shows XYZ Inc. and its current situation. If you like, we've taken the profit or loss for each value item that is being developed. So Accommodation Support Metro, you will recall, delivered a profit on each unit of measurement of $250. We've also included there a new piece of information, which is the current production. So the current production for that Metro unit within the time frame that we are budgeting this service mix is 35. In other words, we can currently provide 35 accommodation support units of measurement for our period. That leaves us with a profit of $8,750, which is 35 times $2.50. And you can see that is extrapolated all the way down that column. So all of the service types, leaving us with a total net income or profit for our organisation in this scenario of $15,540. Noting, of course, that with Employment Other -Country and also with Community Access -Country, we're making a slight loss on those 2 products that we provide. Now let's think about those combinations of services and profits and have a look at a couple of scenarios. In this panel, I've recast those scenarios so that I've only used those very profitable items as a preference, and then use productivity, if you like, to be able to allocate resources to other items that might be less profitable. The red figures in the the middle column rather, are the figures that have actually been changed as for demonstration purposes. So to explain that in a different way, if you look at Accommodation Metro versus Accommodation Country, as you can see, Accommodation Metro Support only provides us $250 profit per unit of measurement, per iteration of services, where the country element, or a similar service in the country, provides us $390. So in this arrangement, I've suggested that XYZ Inc., if you like, take a returns focus and only deliver their 47 units to the country rather than Metro in order to maximise their profits. I've undertaken a similar suggestion with regard to employment, where all 72 units of employment are distributed to the metro area or sought in the metro area rather than the country. And then similarly with community access. Again, these numbers are just made up, and so there's just a very arbitrary view on how these kind of things might be extrapolated. But of course, there's a few things that probably a lot of people listening to this webinar have already identified that are important to consider. For instance, accommodation support in the country, we might want to provide 47 units per period at $390 profit, but we might find that we're actually unable to do that because of the number of beds we command or the inability of us to be able to deploy more beds. Similarly, in the metro area, we will find that our costing changes because we will have vacant beds in the metro area. And while we may not have staff, we will certainly have other costs associated with them. So again, this is purely a numbers game. It doesn't take into account some of the other issues that you need to consider when you're looking at your mix. I will talk about those later in the webinar. However, this is the returns focus. Let's have a look now at what I might term mission balance. That is that we start to look at what we're doing from a mission perspective rather than necessarily just a financial return perspective. Again, those red numbers have changed, and I've changed those red numbers to re-look at making sure that we're delivering services across metro and country, looking at perhaps where we might perceive that there are much more necessary services to be provided, but also providing those services where there are losses incurred by organisations. As you can see, the mission balanced calculus gives us a total net income of about $15,710. Let's look at all three of those now. Or rather, go back just for comparison. I've shown you the mixed comparison, the returns focus, the balanced focus compared to the current focus, to just give you a bit of an idea in this panel what the movements have been in terms of those services. You can see those service returns against the profit that is provided in order to understand what the machinations have been, what I have manipulated in these figures. Again, nothing is right, and these figures are purely based on the accounting returns rather than looking at capacity and so on, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so in comparison, the net result for each scenario is our current arrangement returns about $15,540 to our organisation. Our returns focus returned about $20,780, while our mission balanced view returned about $15,710. Now, you can of course go back to all of those screens and you can reshuffle the numbers continuously to try and work out what the most financial favourable return might be, and also to perhaps give yourself some thoughts around what your mission might look like. And of course, I've just been very arbitrary in terms of determining what is mission focused and what isn't. Some of the other decisions you might take in relation to this material, though, is that you might take strategic decisions, for instance, to build more resource in the country, or you might discontinue some services because they don't meet your mission or your financial objectives as an organisation. And of course that makes a big difference to your financial sustainability into the future. There are some constraints around this, as I mentioned before, and I indicated when I looked at those panels and talked about those panels that they were very arbitrary, and I just picked figures really to try and demonstrate the mix and how you might go about understanding your mix in your organisation a little bit better. But of course there are some constraints to the value of this process, not least of which is that there are demand constraints. It's all very well saying that I want to present or give the opportunity for 42 people to receive accommodation services in the country because it's more financially rewarding for my organisation, but whether the demand exists for those services is something to be considered. There might also be funder constraints, where funders don't allow you to expand services of a particular type, or where you have constraints such that even though some of your services might not return financial returns or even be mission focused, your funder has an expectation that you provide a holistic service, so a service that includes not just financially or, if you like, mission-centric profitable organisations, but opportunities, but also those services that might help to ensure you have a rounded service offering. Of course, you're going to have staffing constraints. You'll have those constraints in the context of staffing numbers and whether you've got enough people to be able to serve the requirements of your organisation, but also whether those people are adequately trained, whether they're able to provide the services where and when they're required. So whether you can deploy staff that might be in the city, for instance, in the country. And if you do deploy those staff in the country, there'll be other costs associated with that that need to be taken into consideration in terms of determining the calculus of your service mix. There might also be materials constraints, and I alluded to this before in terms of materials and infrastructure, where, for instance, you might have motor vehicles that are unable to be used in the country, or you might have to increase your motor vehicle costs if you provide remote services because you need a four-wheel drive rather than a hatchback. Equally, you may not, as I mentioned before, have sufficient beds, notwithstanding you might want to provide services in a location where there might be demand and profitability. The capital constraints might make it difficult for you to provide that. Therefore, all of this depends upon the relevant range in the same way that all costing and pricing depends on the relevant range. And you'll recall from the relevant range that it actually relates to that area where your ideas, the subjective decisions that you make remain relevant. And so webinar 4 is where you should go to have a think about relevant range a little bit more. However, one of the other limitations of mix variance review is that, of course, when you change your mix and you change where you might provide services, or where you change how many of the particular service you might provide, you can have both economies of scale and diseconomies of scale that might change the basic calculations, basic profitability. And you need to think through that too in order to ensure that you're making the right strategic decisions for your organisation. That concludes our look at service mix. You need to go back and have a look at that topic in the context of costing and pricing generally, but also costing and specific services, and think too about the reasonableness test required. So these mix calculations are really important for you to be able to develop a cogent strategy around how you might do things in the future, but equally they are important in terms of the kind of change that might occur in your organisation and how that change might cost you. I guess the final point is to reiterate, of course, that there's no right answer in terms of mix, and each organisation has to determine for itself the extent to which it is comfortable or uncomfortable with its relative profitability as compared to its object and mission focus as an organisation. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you again in the Costing and Pricing Learning Program.